Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy was one of the world's worst industrial disasters, which occurred on the night of December 2-3, 1984, in the city of Bhopal, India. The incident occurred when a pesticide plant owned by Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, leaked around 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, mic gas into the surrounding air, leading to the immediate deaths of over 3,000 people and the eventual death toll of over 15,000 people due to the after effects of the gas. The immediate impact of the gas release was catastrophic, with thousands of people suffering from respiratory problems, blindness, and other severe symptoms. Many victims were unable to access medical treatment due to the sheer scale of the disaster and the inadequate healthcare infrastructure in the area. The long-term impact of the gas exposure was also devastating, with many survivors experiencing chronic health problems such as lung disease, neurological damage, and cancer. The Bhopal gas tragedy was widely attributed to a combination of factors, including inadequate safety measures, poor management practices, and inadequate training and resources for workers. Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, and its parent company, Union Carbide Corporation, UCC, were heavily criticized for their handling of the incident, with allegations of negligence, cover-ups, and lack of accountability. The incident led to a range of legal and regulatory changes in India and globally, with increased scrutiny on industrial safety practices and greater accountability for companies operating in hazardous industries. The Bhopal gas tragedy was a major turning point in global attitudes towards corporate responsibility and the regulation of hazardous industries. Following the disaster, the Indian government took legal action against Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, and its parent company, Union Carbide Corporation, UCC, resulting in a settlement of $470 million in compensation for victims and their families. However, many activists and victims groups felt that the settlement amount was inadequate, and that UCC should have taken greater responsibility for the disaster. UCC argued that the incident was caused by sabotage, while activists and victims groups argued that the company was responsible for inadequate safety measures and poor management practices. The Bhopal gas tragedy led to greater awareness of the dangers of hazardous industries, and prompted many governments and international organizations to take action to prevent similar incidents from occurring. In the years following the disaster, there were increased calls for corporate responsibility and accountability, and many countries introduced regulations to improve safety practices in industries such as chemicals, mining, and energy. Despite these changes, the Bhopal gas tragedy remains a stark reminder of the devastating impact that industrial disasters can have on communities and the environment. It continues to be a source of controversy and debate, with many activists and victims groups calling for greater accountability and justice for those affected by the disaster. In addition to the human toll, the Bhopal gas tragedy also had a significant impact on the environment in and around the city. The gas leak resulted in the release of toxic chemicals into the air and water, contaminating soil, groundwater, and vegetation. The long-term impact of the contamination on public health and the environment is still being felt today, nearly 4 decades after the incident. The disaster also had a major impact on the local economy, with many businesses and industries in the area suffering due to the damage caused by the gas leak. Many residents were forced to abandon their homes and businesses, and many were left with chronic health problems that prevented them from returning to work. The disaster had a particularly significant impact on the poor and marginalized communities in the area, who were the most vulnerable to the effects of the gas leak and had the fewest resources to recover from the disaster. Despite the tragic legacy of the Bhopal gas tragedy, there have been some positive outcomes in terms of improved safety standards and corporate responsibility. The disaster prompted many governments and organizations to take a more proactive approach to industrial safety and environmental protection, with greater emphasis placed on risk management, emergency preparedness, and accountability for companies operating in hazardous industries. Additionally, many victims groups and activists have continued to fight for justice and compensation for those affected by the disaster, keeping the issue in the public eye and raising awareness of the ongoing impacts of industrial disasters on communities and the environment. Another impact of the Bhopal gas tragedy was the increased scrutiny of multinational corporations operating in developing countries. Many argued that the incident highlighted the need for greater accountability and transparency from multinational corporations, particularly those operating in regions with weaker regulatory frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. This has led to increased pressure on multinational corporations to take their social and environmental responsibilities seriously and to operate in a more sustainable and ethical manner. The Bhopal gas tragedy also had an impact on the global discourse around environmental justice. The disaster highlighted the disproportionate impact that environmental hazards and disasters can have on marginalized communities, particularly those in developing countries. This has led to greater awareness and activism around environmental justice issues. with many groups advocating for the rights of communities affected by environmental hazards and calling for a more equitable distribution of environmental risks and benefits. Overall, the Bhopal gas tragedy was a catastrophic event that had wide-reaching impacts on Indian society, the environment, and global attitudes towards industrial safety and corporate responsibility. The disaster served as a wake-up call for governments, organizations, and the public, highlighting the need for greater attention to safety and accountability in hazardous industries, particularly in developing countries where regulatory oversight and enforcement mechanisms may be weaker. While much progress has been made in the decades since the disaster, the ongoing impacts of the tragedy serve as a reminder of the importance of continued vigilance and advocacy around environmental justice and corporate responsibility. The aftermath of the Bhopal gas tragedy also brought to light the issue of medical treatment and compensation for victims. Many of the victims suffered from chronic health conditions and disabilities as a result of exposure to the toxic gas, and their families faced significant financial burdens due to medical expenses and loss of income. In the years following the disaster, many victims groups and activists fought for better medical care and compensation for those affected by the gas leak. However, the response from the Indian government and Union Carbide, the company responsible for the gas leak, was criticized for being slow and inadequate. The government's relief efforts were plagued by corruption and bureaucracy, and many victims did not receive the medical care or compensation they needed. The settlement reached with Union Carbide in 1989 was also criticized as being insufficient, with many arguing that the compensation paid to victims was too low and did not adequately account for the long-term health impacts of the gas leak. The Bhopal gas tragedy remains one of the deadliest industrial disasters in history and continues to have a lasting impact on the victims and the community in Bhopal. The disaster serves as a stark reminder of the importance of corporate responsibility, environmental protection, and social justice in the face of industrial hazards and disasters. While much progress has been made in improving safety standards and corporate accountability since the Bhopal gas tragedy, there is still much work to be done to prevent future disasters and to ensure that the victims of past disasters receive the justice and support they deserve.